Well, today's recipe, macaroons. Not just any macaroons, chocolate macaroons, which also have a little element of surprise. Of course, I'll tell a little about that in detail a little later. Now that we are watching a 100% vegetarian channel, by all means, this recipe, of course, is egg-free, it's vegan, it's gluten-free, and trust me, the most amazing macaroons on the planet. Let's begin. Chocolate macaroons. First things first, let's begin with chocolate ganache, for which I'm going to take dairy cream in a vessel. At this point in time, it's looking slightly thicker, but do not worry, as it heats up, it'll start liquefying. One quick boil, and with this, off goes the flame. Let's transfer the cream into the chocolate. Let's mix this well and ensure you do not whip this. Just mix this with light hands. With the heat of the cream, the chopped chocolate or the grated chocolate would melt like so. Ensure you mix this nicely and evenly, because you'll realize and notice that if it is not mixed properly, you will see two different shades of brown, which is of course not in this case, but otherwise. Mix this well till it's nice and homogeneous. Thick, glossy, shiny. The consistency has to be nice and flowy, like so. With this, your chocolate ganache is done and ready. Let's now move on to the main recipe, and that is making the macarons. Let me now introduce you to a wonderful ingredient which is quite unique, and that is called Aqua Faba. Now, Aqua Faba basically is water in which chickpeas have been cooked. Now, this could be available in two forms, canned, or it could be made at home. Now, canning is actually easy because all you need to do is open the flap, drain the water, put it to use, weigh it properly and perfectly, and that is your Aqua Faba. Another very important method, of a kind of easier method, is to make Aqua Faba at home. What you do is you take chickpeas, you wash them nicely, you soak them overnight. Next afternoon or next evening, you put it under pressure. So basically you take 2 to 3 cups of water, you add in the chickpeas and you cook it under pressure. Now the first whistle could happen just the way it happens, and then you lower the flame. You continue cooking it for at least 20 to 30 minutes so that the water naturally extracts all the starch and gelatin out of the Kabuli chana. You need to keep this refrigerated for a minimum of 12 hours. And I repeat, for a minimum of 12 hours, because that way the water kind of jellifies. This jellification eventually, when we start whipping, starts turning into froth, which eventually, when we add in castor sugar, turns into a peak or like a meringue, which in this case is completely egg-free, vegan and 100% vegetarian. So let's begin with Aqua Faba. Now, just before we jump into the recipe, let me quickly tell you a few things about this macaron. This macaron uses Aqua Faba. It uses almond flour, which is nothing but almond powder, which also can be made at home. Store-bought is easier. It's slightly costlier because, of course, there's a whole process that is involved. But otherwise, almonds need to be soaked, they need to be peeled, they need to be dried, and eventually you need to run them in a blender. Now, when you're running this in a blender, it's also important to not just go all out, because you will end up with almond paste, which is not what is required for this recipe. So almond flour, which is nice and dry. Again, now this recipe uses two different kinds of sugars. The first one is castor sugar, which is going to be used for whipping the Aqua Faba. And the second one is icing sugar, which we are going to mix with almonds. Too much of talking, let's jump in. Now, however fine the almond flour is, it's also important to sieve this once, because you want it to be absolutely fine. Add in the icing sugar at this point in time to ensure that it's eventually lump-free. You can do this tap method, or eventually you could also take a spoon and run this into the sieve itself. While doing this, you can also press and break the lumps of the flour or the icing sugar. Let's put the remainder, like so, in a blender jar to grind this further. Let's transfer all of this back into the sieve and continue the process. Eventually, you'll possibly be left with just a little bit of gritty almond, which could be discarded. Once all of this is sieved well, we mix this and ensure the dry mixture is done and ready. It's important to mix this at this stage so that eventually, when the meringue is ready, you're not spending a lot of time there. Let's keep this aside and move to the Aqua Faba. Before beginning the recipe, ensure that the bowl is absolutely clean. Add in the Aqua Faba and begin the whipping. It's important to tilt the bowl so that all of this is collected at one side and that way the whipping becomes easier. Continue this till it becomes almost like shaving foam. We add in sugar, which is castor sugar, in 3 parts. So that's the first part. We begin whipping. You can take a few seconds of break and then add in the desired color. In this case, I'm adding pink. Scrape the sides and bring this all back to the center of the bowl. This again would make whipping easier. When the peaks kind of hold shape like so, you know that the whipping is just about perfect. You see, it's not moving at all, it's just holding the peaks as desired. I'm going to add in the sieved almond flour and icing sugar in 3 batches. Just mix this like so. And all this batter is of flowing consistency as so. Let's transfer this mixture in a piping bag with a round tip nozzle. Let's pipe this on a silicone mat or a double-lined butter sheet or parchment paper, leaving, of course, a little distance. We tap this twice, thrice over. Eventually, if you still see a few bubbles, you can burst them with a toothpick. These, of course, are slightly technical when it comes to, of course, the baking methods and the making of the entire cookie shells. These are divided, as in the cookie shells or the macaron shells are divided into several parts. Of course, there's the surface, which is nice, clean, shiny, crisp, clean on the outside. And when you turn it, it needs to be soft and chewy, of course, chewy to bite. It also has something called the lip or the feet of the macaron, which eventually you'll come to know once it is perfectly baked. They will rise, and because of the moisture under the biscuit or under the cookie or under the macaron, the moisture eventually starts releasing from the sides, and that eventually gives it a little bit of a jetting out, and that is where it develops feet. Now, it's also important after tapping to rest this for a minimum of 45 minutes. Of course, you can go up to an hour. The whole idea is to ensure that the surface dries out to touch. When you actually tap it or touch it with the tip of your index finger, it should be dry. And that would take at least 45 minutes. So let that happen and then let's wait and watch. It's been an hour of resting, and if you touch the surface of the macaron, it seems dried out, and that's exactly how we want it. Once the finger test is done and ready, this goes in the oven at 130 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes. Now, precisely, you also have to preheat the oven to ensure that it reaches 130 degrees Celsius. This 30 minutes is just about perfect. In case you think it is slightly undone, another 10 minutes on the lower rack is just about perfect. The entire baking, mind you, happens in the middle rack. Remember that. With this, our macaron shells are baked and ready. Now the next step is equally crucial and critical. This needs to cool down. Now for cooling down, ensure that it's never ever cooling down on the tray itself, because that way the bottom of the shell at this point in time, which of course is going to get sandwiched later, will get extremely crisp. That is not what we're looking at. What I used to do as a pastry chef, I'll of course tell you a little later, but for now, I'm just going to pull this out and allow it to rest on the kitchen top. What I used to do as a pastry chef is, as soon as the macaron shells used to get baked, I used to push the entire trolley in the deep freezer. Now that way, with the thermal shock, they immediately used to start cooling down. There's also a process called maturing. Now maturing, again, in case of a macaron, is extremely important, because that way, that really derives the chewiness, the crunchiness, the bite of the macaron. Now, the moment you sandwich them, the sandwich eventually, or the ready macaron, needs to go in the deep freezer and be there overnight. Now, that way what happens? The outside becomes crisp and the inside becomes wonderful and chewy, exactly the way you would like to eat a Parisian macaron. For now, let this cool down completely. It's been 30 minutes. Let's carefully check. The bottom has become nice and crystal-like, and that's exactly what we are looking at. Let's pipe in the ganache for this, of course. So you can also use a nozzle or a star nozzle, anything that you like. And in that cavity, here comes a surprise, and that is a fruit jam or any other compote of your choice. Let's pack this like so. And with this, you have your macaron done and ready. Similarly, let's pack in some more. With this, ladies and gentlemen, chocolate macarons, Parisian style, done and ready. While I enjoy these with a cup of espresso, you can also eat these like a dessert. Actually, eat these like a dessert, but also try this with espresso. Pack these for your family and friends as a lovely hamper. But if I may add, steal a few for yourselves. Remember that.